Good afternoon. We'll be getting started in just a moment. Thank you for your patience as everyone joins the call. All right. Welcome to our MPF webinar, Prairie Planting Establishment and Stewardship Q&A with Jerod Huebner, our very own Director of Prairie Management. My name is Amanda Lansbury-Amrup, and I am the Events and Communications Coordinator for the Missouri Prairie Foundation and Grow Native program. Thank you all for joining us for this Prairie Plantings and Stewardship webinar today. Before we continue, I'll be walking through a few of our webinar basics. When you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A section of Zoom, which you will find on the bar at the bottom of your Zoom window. Lily Germeroth, our MPF Conservation Program Associate, will join Jerod on screen at the end of the presentation to read your submitted questions aloud. As always, Lily will be synthesizing questions so we can cover as much ground as possible. All of you have our gratitude in advance for your thoughtful live submissions. Now I'd like to more thoroughly introduce Jerod Huebner. As MPF's Director of Prairie Management, Jerod oversees planning and execution of prairie projects, including invasive species control, prescribed fire, and all other aspects of the stewardship when it comes to MPF's prairies. He also administers prairie stewardship grants and participates in outreach and education activities. Jerod earned a Bachelor's of Science in Fisheries and Wildlife Sciences from the University of Missouri, Columbia in 2010. While in college, he worked at MPF's and MDC's Prairie Fork Conservation and Expansion Areas in Callaway County, Missouri, on a variety of prairie reconstruction activities. After graduating, Jerod worked as a wildlife biologist at the August A. Busch Memorial Conservation Area in St. Charles, Missouri. Among his duties in that position were managing 18,000 acres of high public use conservation areas in the St. Louis region, preparing management plans, supervising staff, grant writing, and numerous outreach activities. He holds a Level 3 Fire Burn Boss certification and has conducted numerous wildlife population surveys over the years. Notably, Jerod was named Wildlife Conservationalist of the Year by Conservation Federation of Missouri on March 6, 2020. Jerod, we appreciate you taking some time inside away from the elements to educate on these important topics. Thank you, and I'll now turn things over to you.
Okay, thank you. So I've got 7 or 8 slides to go through pretty quickly here, and then basically it's going to be just a Q&A after that. So um, save your questions here and jot down notes as we go through these slides. They'll be fairly brief. So just to highlight the basic steps of your reconstruction, and this applies to 40, 80 acre plantings as well as little bitty portions of your yard, 1 acre things. Doesn't really matter the size. All of these steps will apply to the reconstruction that you're planning on. So you want to have some basic information on your site history, and then your prep is your first step. So we'll get a little bit more into each of these as I go through. The next item on the list would be to remove or eradicate invasive species, seed planting and sourcing and selection. So, or seed or plant sourcing, sorry. So if you do, sometimes we also plant individual plants into our reconstructions, just to add diversity. It might be things that are hard to acquire seed from or things that just don't produce seed. And so we'll buy those individual plants and put them in along with our seed. And then comes the planting. There's numerous ways to get the seed on the ground. Maintenance during establishment. So that would be how you're manipulating the vegetation while those plants are getting established and the seed is germinating, and then your long-term management of the site. Site history and prep. So basically what we're going for here is bare ground. You need a bare ground scenario for the seed to get in that top 1/8 inch of the soil surface. So you really don't want to throw seed down if there's a thatch layer or existing sod, or leaf litter, things like that. The seed has to be in contact with bare soil. So somehow you want to remove the current vegetation. We do that through herbicide application and burning. So we'll spray out the existing sod, say it's fescue or Bermuda grass, things like that. Kill that out with herbicide, and then follow up with prescribed burns. And this typically takes around 3 applications of herbicide. So a lot of times we'll do fall, spring, and fall. So it takes around a year and a half to achieve this. You can do some shallow tillage. So with it like a pull behind tiller or a garden tiller if it's a really small spot in your yard. We typically don't do a lot of tillage just because you are disturbing the ground, you're stirring up more seeds, and you're also disturbing the like the fungi and things like that in the ground. So it can be detrimental to the soil when you do tillage. But a lot of times, given a certain scenario, this might be your best option. Other options for small sites would be things like solarization with tarps, or just smothering it out. I've heard of people using cardboard, things like that, to kill the vegetation. Um, so one thing you want to do is try to be informed on the history of your site. So this picture on the right here is a photo of our Carver Prairie reconstruction that we worked on. There was an old home site here. You can see the skid steer in the background. There was a lot of trash and debris we had to haul off beforehand, just to prep for a clean seed bed. These small tree sprouts that you see are tree of heaven, which are really invasive. There were several large mature trees around this old home site, and we cut those out. You can see the brush pile in the background, but we knew there was going to be a lot of these sprouts coming up since the mature trees were there. So when you remove that dense tree canopy, you're going to have a lot of seedlings coming up. And so that's just part of being informed on that site, knowing that we're going to have to battle these seedlings for a couple of years before it's ready for seed. Um, some other issues that you can run across, especially in urban settings, would be things like clover, lespedeza, or even if you have a farm and the farmer has always overseeded the pastures with clover. Once you kill out that fescue, clover will really come in thick after the sod is removed. Lespedezas do the same thing. So you want to kind of be informed and know a little bit of background about the site just to know what you're dealing with and how long the preparation might take before you're going to achieve that bare ground situation. Seed selection. Um, you want to do a little bit of put a little bit of thought into selecting the appropriate seed for your site. So um, you can find this out pretty quickly in one growing season just by monitoring your site. Is it moist or dry? Um, when you get rainfall, does the water puddle or run off real quickly? How quickly does the soil dry out? You contact various agencies to find out soil types, things like that. You can find those online as well, to see if it's a deep soil, shallow rocky, clay soil, lots of chert. That's going to help inform you on what type of seed is going to do well on your site. And then just taking into account how much shade your site gets in a daytime. So um, things like compass plant aren't necessarily going to grow really well in a part to mostly shaded environment. So it can really save you a lot of money that could be wasted if you're buying full sun plants and putting them in a partly shaded environment. They're just not going to do very well. Some general rates for broadcasting. I typically stick to the top one, the 2 pounds of grasses and 5 pounds of forage per acre. This is just a general number that I shoot for. Obviously, if I have the funding and the ability to put down more forage per acre, I will. It's just going to produce a better planting quicker. But the 2 pounds and 5 pounds is a good starting area for larger plantings. Rarely do I go over the 2 pounds of grasses per acre. The only reasons I might do this would be like in an urban setting where there's a lot of weed competition, or if we know there's going to be some problematic things coming in like brush species, or um, maybe we know there's clover we're going to have to deal with, and so we want a lot of grass to shade that clover out quickly. Um, Otherwise, going more than 2 pounds of grasses could compete against those forbs and really kind of hamper their establishment in the early stages. And then if you're working in a smaller setting, say a backyard or a quarter acre lot, something like that, you could even go down to the PLS per square foot seed rate. So that's pure live seeds. And the general recommendation for that is 20 to 60. So on a really small site, I would go up to that 60 PLS seeds per square foot. Like I said, that again, that's same scenario as above. That's just getting more plants on the ground quicker. You're going to see the flowers sooner, and it's going to be that pretty prairie planting that you expected in a shorter time frame than if you went down to the 20. So, and then a couple things, just points of caution. You want to make sure the seed is Missouri native. So you can get online and find hundreds of different seed vendors. A lot of them will have Missouri native seed, but a lot of them will also have other seed from Florida and California. Switchgrass is notorious for this. It's actually can be difficult to find Missouri native switchgrass. There's a lot of cultivars out there that have been developed for grazing or haying or biofuels. Those are going to be really aggressive, get really tall, and that's not something you're going to want in your planting generally. So pay attention to where the seed is coming from, exactly what species it is, and then that's going to yield your best results in these reconstruction plantings. And generally speaking, seed collected closer to your area will do better in your reconstruction. So, oops, sorry. So, the only thing you run into in Missouri is if say you're on the Ozark border, and you're kind of shallow, rocky soils, you could get seed from up near St. Louis that's very similar growing conditions, but let's say it's 4, 5, 6 counties away. And then if you buy seed that's only 2 counties away, but it's from the Osage Plains, which has deeper soils, that might be a scenario where you go a little further away and get seed that is adapted to growing in the Ozarks, and not like much deeper soil. So kind of pay attention to that a little bit. In the end, as long as it's Missouri native or really close to Missouri, it's going to do well in your plantings. So then we're on to the planting stage. Kind of the general rule is December 15th to February 15th. The main reason for that is a lot of those forbs need to be scarified, and they also need to kind of get incorporated into the upper soil surface. So if you're out there on May 15th planting your seed, there are a lot of things that are going to come up in June, shortly after you plant that. Mainly your grasses, maybe a couple of really weedy wildflowers. A lot of those plants didn't get a chance to get incorporated in the soil. When you plant them in the wintertime, that freeze thaw process does that, and it also acts to scarify the seed. And then some of those wildflowers are also very early blooming. So if you're planting a species that typically blooms in late March, and you're not planting that seed until May, you've missed that bloom time for that year. So you've kind of wasted that seed, essentially, for the year. So shoot for that December 15th, right around the first of the year, is a really good time. I like to plant with snow on the ground, especially in larger plantings. You can see the picture on the right is a general setup that we use. It's called a pendulum seeder, and it has that little tail sticking out the back that basically flings the seed as you drive along. The snow on the ground lets me see exactly where I've driven, and it also lets the seed show up on the snow. Um, every year we don't get snow, so it's not always possible. But if there is snow on the ground, it's really nice to go ahead and do the seedings at that time. So, um, and then if you're broadcasting, especially in that tub you can see on the right, it's good to mix in some sort of a carrier with the seed. Pelletized lime, you can get that at any farm store. Rice hulls, sawdust, or sand seem to work really well. You want to choose something that flows through your seeding device really well. So if you're using a hand broadcast seeder for your wildflower seeds, you're going to have a lot better luck with sand. than you would say with sawdust or rice hulls, because those are a lot fluffier. They're not going to flow real well through a small seed hole. Pelletized lime would seed really well out of a hand or a push along seeder. I prefer something more like the sawdust or rice hulls in the seeder that we use there in the photo. So give that some thought and decide what you're using to seed with before you choose that. The reason I like to do that, it helps spread your seed out. So especially if you're doing a really small planting, um, say an acre or less, you're literally going to have a couple handfuls of wildflower seed, and so it's really easy to throw all that seed out in a short amount of time, and then you've only covered a portion of your area and you're out of seed. So if you mix it all in, it just allows you to overspread everything multiple times and get really good coverage and make sure you don't run out of seed. Establishment maintenance. So it's really important to control and suppress weed competition during the first year after seeding. In this photo on the right, this is at our Snowball Hill Prairie. I think we're close to 5 years in on this planting. You can see sweet clover um, just to the left of the blue musk thistle. The blue musk thistle was treated with herbicide and dye. We're still battling sweet clover and musk thistle in this site, so it's definitely diminishing. But it's not just the first year after seeding. It's going to be for multiple years for some of these aggressive plants, especially if they've been there for decades, which they likely were at this site. Um, Again, this site was, like I mentioned earlier, it was covered in smooth brome. We spent 2 years eradicating the brome, and we knew we had some thistles. We knew we had a little bit of sweet clover. We planted all of our native plants, and then in about 2 years, the musk thistle and the sweet clover really, really shot up, and we're much more well established than I had initially thought. So um, mowing will control both of these species. A lot of times, depending on the species, if it's Johnson grass, mowing does not control it. You have to use herbicide. So you really just need to keep an eye on things. My kind of general rule for establishment mowing would be if you can stand in your planting in a given spot on average and look down and see at least 50% bare soil, you're in good shape. When it gets over 50% shading, say 75, 80% of the ground is shaded, that means 75 or 80% of your little wildflowers that are trying to come up are in full shade, and they need that sunlight to get established. So when you get it to that upper, 3/4 of the area is shaded, it's time to go ahead and mow it back down to around 6 inches, 8 inches tall. Depending on the rain in a given year, you may need to mow it 3 or 4 times that first year, especially. So, and then again, just make sure and monitor for those invasive species as you're going along. Generally, you're going to know what invasives you have going into a project. Sometimes you'll have some new ones pop up once you eliminate the predominant sod. And then for long-term management, my favorite long-term management practice is just dormant season burns. On a reconstruction, even small plantings, I've got a small one in my yard that I burn periodically. As soon as there's enough thatch layer to carry a fire, I like to burn it because you got those little bitty forbs. They may be 3, 4 inches tall, real spindly stems. The first couple of years, they're investing in their roots still. And so they don't have a lot of energy to send up a really robust stem that can punch through lots of built up vegetation. So if you've got 2, 3 inches of thatch on top of that, a lot of times you're going to smother out some of those really young forbs. So it's important to remove that thatch layer to give those new seedlings the best chance possible. So sometimes in a planting we can burn the first year after planting. So if we planted, say this February, we could burn by next December, just depending on what has grown in. A lot of times, however, it's not until the second or third year until you can burn. So, um, if you cannot burn, say if you're in town and your city doesn't allow burning, you're around some sort of a sensitive type of infrastructure or something like that, you can mow. Um, just keep in mind when you're mowing, you are creating thatch. So whatever you can do to minimize that in a small uh, park-like setting, yard setting, it's much easier to mow with like a side discharge, like a riding lawn mower, which will blow all the debris off to one side, and then you can rake it up and remove it. The main thing is after you're done doing that management for the year, you want to be able to see bare ground. So, um, and then again, invasives and other undesirable species should be monitored and treated as needed. So, in urban settings, especially Joplin, where I'm at, we battle Bermuda grass quite a bit. Some of the vining plants like clematis or honeysuckle, as well as Johnson grass, are problematic. So you're always going to be battling something. Just keep an eye on it and don't let it get out of control. Once it's established really well, it's a much bigger problem because then it's built up a seed bank and it's kind of there to stay for quite a while. So, and with that, that was kind of the basics and the stewardship part of the reconstructions, and we'll turn it over for questions with Lily.
Yeah, awesome, Jerod. Thank you so much. Always great to hear from you. We have a series of questions, and I'm just gonna pepper you with them. The first one that came in was, what is the minimal area for a prairie? A lot of, or we have almost 150 people on this call. I'm sure there's a spectrum of very small backyard gardens to managing acres of prairie. So can you speak to the size of these remnants and restorations?
So our sites, they range. We've got some complexes that are upwards of 600, 700 acres total. And then, we've got little remnants that are less than 20 acres. One of the sites we manage is a little 3/4 acre remnant in Joplin that we've added some reconstructions around it. So, um, our sites can vary hugely. I've got a little bitty planting in my backyard. It was literally if you drive by and you see storm shelters in backyards, when we moved to Joplin, they had a storm shelter that they basically just dug a hole in the clay and rocks. And it was just covered in rocks, clay, and Bermuda grass when I moved in, and I thought it was nice. Or so I cleaned up a bunch of the rocks, killed the Bermuda grass, and literally just took the sweepings off of our brush hog from when I was mowing fire lines, scattered that seed, and now it's a really nice prairie planting. So, and it's probably 10 by 10, excluding the concrete top of the storm shelter. So it's a really small piece. I can stretch my garden hose out to it and burn it every couple of years, and it's very low maintenance for the most part. So, um, you could have a 3 foot by 3 foot little planting if you wanted. It doesn't really, the size doesn't really matter that much.
Totally, love that. Um, there were some questions about prairie establishment in very low soil, with soil that has very low productivity. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, the biggest thing that I would look at, I would definitely take a soil sample and look at your pH. A lot of times, low productivity is going to be linked to really low pH. Um, that being said, prairie plants are adapted to a really wide range of growing conditions. As long as you're not down in like a 3 or 4 pH situation, and lime can fix that pretty quickly. Within a year or two, you can have your pH up into a suitable range. But you can choose species that grow in those poor conditions, like glade type species. There's glade species that grow in both wet and dry conditions because there are some glades that are pretty moist. They're just very shallow soil. And so I would just pay attention to the pH and then choose plants that are well adapted to poor growing conditions.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think the point that we hear with that often as well is like, don't often people want to fertilize their plantings to sort of like help, but that actually, can you speak to that with prairie plantings?
Yeah, a lot of times, like with our prairie plantings, for the most part, if they're growing fescue sod on them, we don't we don't even do a soil test. All of these prairie plants are going to grow just fine where any pasture plants grow. And so the only time I would do the soil tests, um, would be where you just see a lot of bare ground and erosion and things like that. There's something causing all of that bare ground, and you may need to figure out what's going on there. But yeah, the fertilizer especially, we used to actually 20 years ago mix seed with fertilizer, and then found out nitrogen actually will kill the seed if it sits in with it too long. All the especially nitrogen fertilizer, all it does is stimulate the grasses to grow, and then they'll outcompete the forbs and kind of suppress them. So if I'm doing anything, it's applying lime and not fertilizer.
Great. One question about in, say, like 100 feet by 100 feet area, they can't burn it. And you mentioned shallow tilling for sort of site preparation. Can you speak to if they can't burn, would, how would you help this person best prepare this site, in order to get good seed soil contact and everything?
So initial preparation would just be to mow it really, really short. So shorter than you would typically mow a yard.
Hmm.
And then you're going to expose a lot of bare ground doing that. They make various things you can drag around, like a little harrow you can buy from Tractor Supply, pull behind a mower, basically kind of scuffs up the surface. You can spread the seed and then drag that over again, and it also kind of smushes that seed into the roughed up dirt that you have. And then as far as maintaining that site, I would probably lean towards not planting very much grass in a scenario where you can't burn, just because that grass is all going to fall over and kind of act as a mulch layer. You could plant some shorter grasses like your drop seeds, maybe little blue stem. Um, Virginia rye doesn't get a big clump usually where it's going to lodge over, like Indian grass, big blue stem, things like that. So focus on your really short grasses and drop seeds, things like that, because those aren't going to accumulate a huge thatch layer. And then your wildflowers, especially, because you can go through and mow the wildflowers down, and then it's just coarse stems and leaf material that's going to rot away pretty quickly. Your heavy grasses, your big blue stems and things like that, are what's going to create the heavy thatch layer that inhibits future season growing conditions.
Hmm. We had some questions of, say, someone has a sort of native grass presence, but they want to incorporate more forbs. How would that be a sort of mow what you've got and put forb seeds down? What would that process look like?
Yeah, it kind of depends on how dense the existing warm season grass is. So if it's just sparse warm season grasses, you could mow or burn off what is there, like say right now, and interseed some wildflowers, and you're going to have pretty good luck doing that. If it's really dense warm season grass, you're going to have to do something to set that grass back, whether it's you could maybe lightly graze it in, May 15th or something, as soon as it's starting to come up. You could hay it early, just something to knock that grass back, because as soon as that grass shoots up, 16, 18 inches in a month's time in May, um, you've pretty much shaded out everything that you've planted, and most of that stuff's going to die. Um, in years past, I've actually sprayed warm season grass plantings with Roundup, and you really only get about a half, 50% kill on your established warm season grasses. And so you're left with a pretty good stand of, 50% grass, and you can seed right into that. So it depends highly on how thick that grass is.
Hmm. There is one sort of specific in this scenario. Would you ever suggest doing that, interspersing with forbs like in strips or in, like, is there any other, do you have any suggestions for, yeah, specific
So yeah,
areas?
you could absolutely do that. Like say you had, a 10-acre square of warm season grass, and you had a four-wheeler, you could go spray, 10-foot wide strips through that. you could certainly go and spray strips of warm season grass out, kill those, plant your forbs in there. You've likely got a seed bank of grass in those strips, so it's going to come back, but it allows time for those wildflowers to establish. They'll likely seed out as well and kind of move on their own, especially things like ashy sunflower that form colonies. Those will invade into the grassy areas as well. So a scenario like that would work.
Awesome. A few questions now about invasive plant management. The first of which is Cesia, which, multiple people, can you just give us your quick, what's your best practice for Cesia? And we'll also follow up with specific resources with our recommended percentages and everything, but can you indulge us in that?
Yeah, so typically a triclopyr product is going to be the best method of treatment. So basically around June 1st to June 15th, just depending on how warm it is, early in the spring, early June, start looking for it. You're going to see it up, 8 to 10 inches tall around that time period. And then basically you want to hit it before it really starts branching out. So it's going to be a single stem plant in the spring, and then as you get later into July and August, it's going to start branching out at the top, especially the mature plants. The later in the growing season it gets, the harder it gets to kill. So especially if it's dry and really hot, it doesn't absorb that chemical nearly as well. If I could get all of our Cesia spraying completed the last week of June and first 2 weeks of July, I would have it all done in those 3 weeks because it dies really quickly, and you seem to get a really good kill on it. If you wait until the last week of August and spray all of your planting for Cesia at that time period, you'll see some's dead, you'll see some is kind of yellow, and some will look like you didn't even spray it. And so if you get late in the year like that, we actually a lot of times will switch to a chemical with the active ingredient methylfuron. And there's a few different brands of that, just because it does get a lot harder to kill, especially during those drought conditions and things like that. But you can spray it as soon as you see it, but typically you want 8 to 10, 12 inches of new growth, and use triclopyr, pasture guard, or remedy, things like that.
Great, thank you. Question, yeah, a few folks had questions of if you should spray for invasives, after, during the growing season, this sort of hesitation of spraying to kill one species right next to these species that you've been trying to establish. Do you have any recommendations for how to minimize damage in that process?
So we always use dye. You saw the thistle earlier, it had the blue dye on it. And as long as you're not just being reckless, you can be, especially with a backpack sprayer or even on an ATV, you can pull up right next to the plant or a colony of plants. You can spray the nozzle straight down on those plants. And so if there is a plant right underneath the Cesia, it's pretty hard to not spray that plant because you're spraying down. But if you're spraying out, you're hitting the Cesia and you're hitting everything behind it for a couple of feet, 18 inches, something like that. So spraying down will help minimize that. The other thing you can do too, if you have, say you have a pale purple coneflower right next to the Cesia, if you're using that blue dye, it allows you to see if you got overspray. If you did overspray on a desirable plant, just chop it off the ground with scissors or a knife, and it's not going to absorb that chemical. So that doesn't work when you're out spraying 1,000 acres as well as it does when you're at your house or a really small planting that you can, monitor real intensely. But yeah, just as long as you're going slow and being careful, and then like I say, the blue dye is really helpful for us to make sure we're spraying only what we want to spray.
Totally. Yeah, that's a great point of if you can clip the plant, maybe it's done for this year, but that way the roots are still good.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have more questions about sort of prepping your site, and we had one question with cover crops seeding in the fall before a prairie mix. Have you worked with this before, or can you speak to that?
Yeah, so we did some cover crops at our carver planting as well as Summit Snowball as well, Snowball Hill. And so, yeah, I mean, in theory, they work pretty good. It was a good way for us to get our seed bank prep paid for through partner work. So we did some dove fields in cooperation with National Turkey Federation. So they paid for the herbicide and all the prep work for putting in the sunflowers, and then we were able to hold youth dove hunts, things like that. And so you get that herbicide and that prep kind of paid for through the grant. If you're a hunter, you have the added benefit of, holding a dove hunt, something like that, or a food plot for other animals. The only thing I don't like about it is, like in the instance of the sunflowers, we had Cesia in there, and I was in there spot spraying Cesia when I needed to be broadcasting it, because I didn't want to kill the sunflowers. Um, we've done wheat and rye as well. And again, you're kind of, the wheat and the rye are like another sod grass. So say you've eradicated your fescue and you're just letting it grow another year to see what comes up. So that wheat and the oats or whatever you might plant is going to suppress things like clover or ceresia or lespedezas that you want to pop up, because you want to kill those out of the seed bank. And so I almost like to just eradicate the sod and then eradicate things that come up for the next year, year and a half, and just let everything keep coming up so you can kind of exhaust that seed bank. I feel like if you're putting in these cover crops, you're kind of suppressing it a little bit, kill out a little bit. And then there's also the added time of putting that seed in, the added cost of the seed and the maintenance of it. So I've not seen a huge benefit in terms of establishment of wildflowers when you add the cover crops in. So to me, it's an added cost and time, and I feel like it almost hurts you in the long run if you're suppressing things you want to kill out.
Great, thank you. One question on how do you recommend people to figure out the history of their site, or what resources do you use, and yeah, how can people figure that out?
Yeah, so one big thing that we use, and you can find them online. I think you can get them at your county recorder's office. We use government land office notes. They call them GLO notes, and that allows us to have a kind of an overview of the site, and it tells us this site was entirely prairie. 200 years ago, there wasn't a tree on this entire site. And so we know it was 100% prairie. Or it might tell us this site was prairie on the north end, kind of a scrub savanna in the middle, and on the south end was when it transitioned to historical, what would have been like savanna and woodland conditions. And that really helps us, because historically, if it was always a woodland, it's going to be really hard to make it be pure prairie. It's going to have the seed bank. It's going to want to trend, just because of the soils. It's going to want to trend brushy. It's going to want to grow trees and various brush species more so than something that was 10 miles from a creek, and was pure prairie. So that can help inform your site and make a decision up front of, this is what this site should be, and that's going to make it easier on you in the long term, putting it back to what it should be. You don't want to try to put a prairie in something that used to be bottomland hardwoods, if that makes sense. So those GLO notes are helpful. Like I said, you can get online, and I'm not sure if it's NRCS website. If you just Google like soil maps for the state of Missouri, you should be able to find soil maps for your area, and that'll tell you what type of soil you have, and that's again going to help inform your seed selections. The USDA offices, FSA, your PLCs, private lands conservationists, in your county offices, those are going to be really big assets for getting this information for you up front as well.
Great, thank you. We have one specific question about a site with bare clay or thin topsoil. Do you recommend any sort of like amendments with, black dirt or leaf litter, or yeah, do you have any considerations there?
I mean, if you have the means to do that, that would be great, especially in a small planting. It's moving dirt can get really costly really quick, and then spreading it. You want to kind of pay attention to what dirt you're bringing in. I did a similar thing in my yard because my yard's pretty terrible here in Joplin. It's all chert and clay, and I brought in topsoil for raised garden beds, and then found out really quickly there was a lot of Cesia growing in my garden beds. So you don't want to bring in a problem potentially, whether it's Johnson grass or Cesia. A lot of that topsoil is going to come from bottomlands around rivers, things like that. So Johnson grass could be in there pretty easily. In a small setting, it would be fine. I think if you were doing a 20-acre field that was very clay, rocky, it's not going to be feasible from an economic standpoint to do that. You can always, we've done some things where we purchased prairie hay. So, like, if we hayed one of our prairies, you can go and unroll that hay on the prairie as a means of seeding it. You're creating a thatch layer to kind of shade the soil, and also adding nutrients to the ground. And you can buy prairie hay fairly inexpensively if you have a small enough area. So that's kind of twofold. You're adding seed while you're also adding some kind of thatch as well as organic matter. So that would be kind of one option. The others, just economically, I don't think they'd be very feasible.
Thank you. With that, we have one question of someone working on a project where buildings and hardscape is being demolished and there is not a lot of soil in the surface. Any thoughts on how to best approach restoring the soil after this hardscape has been removed?
I mean, assuming the hard, rock layer and concrete and things like that are removed, and you're down to bare ground, um, mulch could be an asset. If you could get, whether it's from a city dump site or purchase mulch, you can add that down. The thing with that thin soil is it's just going to dry out so quickly with the forbs in it, and so the mulching can help. And then you're also adding the organic matter once it decomposes. Um, Again, you do struggle with bringing in invasives because people are throwing Johnson grass and things like that into the city dump site where they give away mulch. So that's one thing to think about. We've had some sites like that on it. We've got 52 acres here in Joplin that we've reconstructed. Um, I think you just need to go into it knowing that it's not going to be perfect. There's going to be bare areas that used to be the foundation of that building. And unless you really go to extensive means to repair that area, you'll have plants scattered, and it may be more of a glade-like condition where you have a lot of bare ground, but you do have some really good natives scattered through there. And if it's a small enough site, you're not going to be out a lot of money on seed either. So, but yeah, between the mulch and then just going into it knowing this isn't going to be a pure solid stand of liatris or echinacea, kind of have that open mind going into it and just know you're making it to be something better.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. We had a couple questions about winter sowing. Particularly, you mentioned you like utilizing a snow cover to broadcast your seed. We had folks asking, if you don't get a snow, is there any concern with like moisture for the seeds that you get out? Will you need to amend with some added water, or can you speak to that more?
No, I mean, as long as you're getting the seeds out in a timely fashion in that, December through February time period, there's going to be ample rainfall, freeze thaw cycles between then and spring. And it's going to suck that seed into the upper surface of the soil. And, the ground stays really moist once we get one or two rains in the winter anyways. And so, one rainfall goes a long ways. Once we get one. So I wouldn't worry about watering or doing anything. Actually, one thing that we've had happen in the past, seeding on snow, is the birds are looking for food when it's snowy out. And so that is one point of caution, I guess. If you see it snowed and it's going to be really, really cold for 2 weeks straight, you might wait until the end of that snowy period to seed, so that the seed melts with the or goes in with the snow, rather than just sits up on top of the snow for 2 weeks for the birds to eat. We've seen that where we planted, 30 or 40 acres, and it's just covered in birds, and they can eat a lot of that seed in a couple weeks' time. So, but yeah, if you don't get that snow, just seed it onto the bare ground, and it's going to be fine.
Great, thank you. We had another question about, if you toss out those seeds maybe a little late, do you have any speculations to, are those seeds just sort of done for, or will they, do you think, contribute to the next year's growth? Just musing.
Yeah. I mean, some of them are gonna go bad. They could rot. As long as they're being incorporated into that soil surface, I feel like they're just, a lot of them, a good portion of them are just contributing to the seed bank for the future years. And so, just because you spread Indian paintbrush, too late this year and it's not going to come up, that doesn't mean it may not come up in future years. A lot of these things, literally we'll plant species and we won't see that flower for 4 or 5 years. And so there's a lot of times where I think it was a waste of time and money putting certain species out, and then all of a sudden one pops up. And so, uh, just get it in, even if you're running a couple weeks late, get it planted. Mice can eat some of the seed, birds can eat some of the seed, some will rot, but odds are there's a good amount of it that's still going to carry into the next year. If we went and tilled up an entire prairie, you're going to have a lot of seeds come back. So those seeds just sit there and wait for an opportunity to grow. So it's not like, just because we didn't get it to come up this first year because we ran late, that seed was a complete waste. Yeah, go ahead and get it in. You've done the prep. That's the hard part. Get the seed in and take what you can get year one and hope for the best next year.
Definitely, thank you. That speaks to a couple of comments of people saying, I've been seeding every winter and I'm getting some of these species, but am I doing anything wrong because I'm not seeing these species? And I think that, yeah, you just highlighted that sometimes it takes time, or maybe the conditions aren't aligned for every species that you're seeding. We
Absolutely.
we had another question about specifically yellow nut sedge has come up from a few different folks. Are you familiar with how to, or do you have any recommendations on managing it?
I get this question a lot. I know the guy that I work with Joplin Parks, who manages the golf course, deals with this. I don't have an issue in our large reconstructions. They're on such a large scale. I can't worry about, a 15th of an acre of patch of nut sedge that comes up. It'll come up in my yard as well, in my garden plots, and it is problematic. I've never personally dealt with it. I know they use a product. I want to say it's called Fusilade. You might double check that, but they use one specifically for sedges. But I do think if you spray it on your other plants, it's probably going to kill a lot of your other plants as well.
Mhm.
But yeah, look into those sedge specific herbicides if it's something you think you do want to treat, because sedges are notoriously hard to kill with Roundup. Farmers deal with it all the time, and if it's really a competition problem in your planting, they do make species, family specific herbicides like that.
Great, thank you. We had one question. You mentioned your sort of rule of thumb when looking at the sort of how close plants are growing, how much bare soil there is. Can you repeat that point in order to understand maybe if you need to be seeding maybe with additional forbs, or can you explain that concept again for people?
Yeah, so if I walk out into a center of say a 40-acre square, and I walk all across it and look, and so if you get the average of you look down at the ground and you can see about 50% of the soil surface is getting sunlight. So you got about 50% is shaded, 50% is getting sunlight. So as the sun moves through the sky, you're getting about 50% sunlight on those plants throughout the day or more. If you're out there in a planting and you look down and it's almost completely shaded or like 75% shaded, it's time to mow because you're not getting nearly enough sunlight for those forbs to get their roots established. And so generally that's going to be anywhere from 12 to 18 inches tall. You're going to want to mow it back to 6 or 8 inches tall. So you really want it to be growing in that kind of 6 to 12 inch height and not the 12 to 24 inches tall that first year and even the second year into this plantings.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We had another question about someone established probably like a 50-50 grass forb mix, and they're finding a lot of success with their forbs, but not the grasses coming back or establishing. Do you have any thoughts on that? And do you ever have to add more grass seeds later in restorations?
The only so I always err on the side of going really light on grasses. And the only reason I add more grasses is if I want it to burn better. If we plant a planting and the grass was so light 3 years into it we can't carry a fire, then the grasses probably need to be thickened up a little bit. And I typically keep our big grasses at a minimum. So your big blue stem, your Indian grass, um, even things like gamma grass or switchgrass can get pretty aggressive. So I will keep those rates really light. I prefer the drop seeds, the little blue stem, the wild rye. They're not nearly as competitive or aggressive against the forbs. They don't get as tall. And so that's really the only reason I would add the grass is if, we've got a 40-acre site and only 20 acres of it will burn every year, then I know I need to add a little bit more grass to carry that fire through there. As in terms of why their grass didn't take, I don't know. Provided they had, grass that was viable. Seed tests were done on it and it was good grass seed. Grass seed will lose its germination rate much quicker than forbs. So if you store grass seed just for a couple of years, it's going to go bad. Whereas, wildflower seed, as long as you keep it indoors, somewhat climate controlled, it stays viable for quite a long time.
Great, thank you. And we had another question that you addressed then of seed storage. So it sounds like grass seed kind of goes off faster than forbs in maybe a couple years, but can you just elaborate on that a little bit? Seed storage?
Yeah. So grass seed's gonna lose its germination much quicker than forbs, and it varies by species, obviously. But in general, grasses are going to drop off pretty quick, whereas forb seed several years. Keeping it kind of cool. Basically, if I've got seed that I've collected, I like to keep it in my office as opposed to the garage or the shop, just because you're introducing that humidity and the temperature fluctuations outside, whereas a more climate controlled environment is much better. A lot of people, if you have the ability, will keep it in even a freezer. So
Great, thank you. We had one question or a couple more questions about mowing. One of them was, how do you recommend how do people mow higher than 6 or 8 inches off the ground if most people just have a riding lawnmower, or what does that look like?
yeah, so keep in mind these recommendations are coming from me working for the conservation department and now MPF, and so we have a brush hog that can mow higher than that. And so that's in an ideal world, you can mow it, 8 inches or higher. I realize that's not everybody's scenario, and so you're going to be okay if you just put your riding lawnmower at the highest setting and go in and mow it. You do want to pay attention because if typically you're going to have to mow it before it gets above about 12 inches tall. If your planting gets that tall, it's going to be pretty tough going through that with a riding mower. So just don't be too aggressive and be clipping off a bunch of. If you go out there and see a bunch of wildflowers that you're going to be chopping off, I'd say those have grown high enough that they're going to be competitive with whatever grasses and other things are growing in your planting. So um, when you go into that area and say you've got your riding mower and it'll only mow 5 inches high, go in there. Basically, you could even take a ruler and look what is sticking up above 5 inches. Is it just the weeds and the foxtail and things you want to chop off, or is it a lot of your wildflowers that are kind of getting up to 8-10 inches tall? If they're getting up to 8-10 inches tall, just let them grow. If they're reaching the same height, because then they're not getting shaded out, they're growing the same height as everything else, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. And there's a great graphic that was designed through Grow Native that shows this concept that we'll send out tomorrow. But yeah, totally love that, paying attention to what you would be lost. People are calling out in the chat that a tool called Sledgehammer is good for yellow nut sedge. So we'll highlight that and maybe look into it a little bit more. We had a couple questions of what snake is highlighted here on your slide. And did you take this photo? Is this on one of our prairies?
Yeah. So this is on one of our prairies. I won't say where, but Bruce, Shooty, and I were out walking in one of our reconstruction plantings, and it was a cold spring day. It's a bull snake, is what it is. And so I had never seen one in person. I'd seen them in nature centers and things like that, and always wanted to see one. And we were kind of walking along. It was a cold, probably end of March day, and we stopped to kind of just talk and evaluate this reconstruction that we were in. And you can see the grass is really short, and I heard a hissing noise behind us, and Bruce was talking, and I kind of looked around a few different times wondering what the noise was. And it was literally like 2 or 3 feet behind us, just sitting like it was now. And at first, I really didn't know what it was because I'd never seen one in person, and you'd never seen Bruce so excited in his life. And I've seen several of them since then. I see one probably every year to every other year on our prairies. But definitely when I see these or a glass lizard on the prairie, it's kind of one of the highlights of the year. Pretty rare and cool animals to see out there.
Yeah, it's awesome to see what life can be harbored. I'll give us a couple more questions and then we'll wrap up. We've hit the general sort of themes. But we had a question about the phrase like prairie planting versus pollinator planting. They hear both. Maybe they used to hear pollinator more. Now they're hearing prairie planting. Can you speak to this difference?
Yeah, it's just terminology. So it really kind of gets at what you're trying to achieve. When we do and we call ours prairie reconstructions. So reconstruction means you're starting from scratch. A restoration implies that there's something left to restore. So there's existing native plants, and you're making those native plants better. So if you're doing a pollinator planting or a prairie planting, um, if you told me those terms when you said prairie planting, I would think that you're trying to mimic a remnant prairie that's nearby or what your site historically was. So you're going to try to get 80 to 100 plus species in that prairie planting. Whereas if it's a pollinator planting, a lot of times those are just government programs. You might have a 20 species mix or maybe 30 species as a whole lot of species in a pollinator planting. And so to me, that's kind of what those two terms mean. I think they both have very similar benefits and are kind of getting at the same thing. It's just most of the time they're used interchangeably. There's not much of a difference.
Great, thank you. We had some questions about increasing your skills, one of which was like, how do people learn about how to burn their property? And we'll send out resources for this, but if you could speak to it quickly. And additionally with that, just like plant identification skills, knowing what is desirable and what isn't, maybe if they just moved here. We'll send out resources, but if you could speak to those points.
Yeah, so I think MDC's level 1 burn class is a valuable thing to take. You can also come and join us on a burn. We burn we've got 35 sites, and we try to burn approximately 1/3 to 1/2 of our acreage in a year. And so we're going to be burning through about the month of February. Typically, it's around 1 or 2 burns a week. And so that's really good hands-on experience. You can see a wide range of fire conditions, habitats that are burned. We burn woodland units as well. It's really nice to go out and just stand around while you see someone else burning, because you're not the one in charge. So you're not nervous and on edge. And it just really helps you see how fire behaves in different scenarios. And you can ask me all the questions you want when you're out there. We've got folks that come out and literally just take pictures on our burns, and I'm fine with that too. So, um, we can be a resource to help you learn to burn. MDC's level 1 fire class. There are also a few prescribed burn co-ops throughout the state, so it's a group of landowners that get together and help each other burn their properties. If you're looking at doing that burning, there are some resources we can probably send out, as far as if you have a prescribed burn association in your general area, and those would be a great resource to tap into as well. As far as plant identification goes, I would definitely recommend getting one of the Wildflowers of Missouri books. That would be a good start. And then one thing that's really helpful for me, even still, are the apps. So, like the iNaturalist, I think I've got what's it called, like Plant Finder app, things like that. You can literally take a picture of it. It searches the web, and basically it'll get you really, really close, and then you can go look in your book and decide that it's this species. So those are very helpful when you're learning different plants.
Great, thank you so much. And I think that we'll cap it there. We'll try and address any questions that weren't exactly notated tomorrow. And you can always reach out to the outreach at our outreach email, or to me, Lily at Mo Prairie, if you have specific questions, and I can try and navigate getting an answer from Jerod. But Jerod, thank you so much. We appreciate your time and your just wealth of knowledge. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you all.
All right. Thank you, Jerod and Lily, for fielding questions, and thank you to all who contributed to the conversation. Before we conclude today's webinar, I have a couple of announcements about upcoming in-person and online events. First of all, we have 2 guided short-eared owl hikes planned for early 2025, one on one of our own prairies and one on an MDC property. First, join Jeff Cantrell, MPF Technical Advisor, on Friday, February 7th for our first of 2 of those hikes. This one will occur at Pleasant Run Creek Prairie in Vernon County, Missouri. Following that, you can join Jeff on Friday, February 28th for a hike at Shawnee Trail Conservation Area in Barton County, Missouri. Both hikes are free with the option to donate to MPF. Both have separate registrations, and both will begin at 4:30 p.m. on those dates. Jeff has offered hikes like these this past winter, so trust you'll be in knowledgeable company. Next, register now and plan to join us on Zoom Wednesday, January 15th at 4 p.m. for our Grow Native Masterclass, Seeded Tree Islands for Beauty, Shade, and Native Diversity. Some of the questions you might ask yourself: do you have too much lawn? Is your grass sparse because of tree shade? Are you trying to cut the grass on a steep slope, which I actually noticed some comments on in the Q&A? If so, it might be time for a change. Join veteran horticulturalist Scott Woodbury for a masterclass to learn how to plan, install, and maintain a seeded, natural-style woodland landscape with high diversity and low maintenance. This live masterclass will include a presentation and question and answer session. Note that as a master class, a recording will be made available only to those who have registered. The webinar is free to MPF dues-paying members and Grow Native professional members, and it is $15 for non-members. Masterclass fees go to support our nonprofit conservation work, like what you've heard about today, so visit our MPF membership page to become a member and attend all masterclasses for free. Finally, registration is open for our Southwest Illinois workshop, Stormwater Challenges and Native Plant Solutions, happening Friday, February 21st at Lewis and Clark Community College in Edwardsville, Illinois. The goal of this workshop is to explore native landscape solutions to manage stormwater and protect streams and other aquatic ecosystems. During this half-day event, speakers will present on challenges at small residential, large landowner, and community-sized scales, informing participants about specific landscape practices and increasing their knowledge of programs and policies to support stormwater solutions. Advanced registration is required and includes breakfast. Rates are $25 for MPF members and Grow Native professional members, $15 for general students with a valid student ID, and $30 for non-members. Registration for all of the aforementioned events and more can be found at our website under the Events tab. Thank you for joining us. Everyone have a great rest of your evening. Bye-bye.